Hello and welcome to Insomniac Dose. You're welcome to comment your city and the time below. I always enjoy reading them. If you find these stories interesting, please consider subscribing. Let's start tonight's story. I want to make it clear from the beginning that I'm not someone who believes in the supernatural. I worked in data analysis for 6 years. Spreadsheets, algorithms, quantifiable results. The world made sense because it followed patterns you could predict, measure, and control. So when I received the certified letter informing me that I'd inherited my uncle's vineyard in Northern California, my first thought wasn't gratitude or excitement. It was a suspicion. Marcus Hale and I weren't close. He was my father's older brother, the one who'd left Chicago decades ago without explanation, trading urban certainty for rural isolation. We'd exchanged maybe a dozen words at family gatherings when I was young. He smelled like earth and fermentation, spoke in fragments, and always seemed to be listening to something the rest of us couldn't hear. My father called him troubled. My mother called him lost. I called him a stranger. The news of his death came with minimal detail. Natural causes, the attorney said over the phone, though his tone suggested the phrase was more convenient than accurate. There was no funeral, no service, just paperwork, signatures, and a set of keys mailed to my apartment in San Francisco, where I'd been rotting since my layoff 3 months prior. The drive to the vineyard took 4 hours, winding through progressively smaller towns until the GPS gave up and I was navigating by handwritten directions. The property sat in a valley I couldn't find on any map, accessible only by a single-lane road that curved through hills covered in wild grass the color of old parchment. It was late September, harvest season, and the air through my open window tasted thick, sweet and slightly rotten as fruit left too long in the sun. When I finally saw the vineyard, I understood why my uncle had stayed. It was beautiful in a way that felt almost aggressive. Rows upon rows of grapevines stretched across the valley floor in perfect geometric precision, each line so straight it hurt to look at. The vines themselves were heavy with clusters of dark grapes that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The farmhouse sat at the property's center, a 2-story structure of weathered wood and stone, surrounded by a wraparound porch that faced the fields like a watchtower. I parked in the gravel drive and stepped out. The silence hit me first. No birds, no insects, just wind moving through the vines with a sound like distant conversation. The air was warmer here than it should have been, and that sweet rot smell was stronger, almost fermented, as if the earth itself was exhaling alcohol. The farmhouse door was unlocked. Inside, everything was immaculate. Hardwood floors are polished to a dull shine, furniture arranged with careful intent. Dishes were washed and stacked in the cupboard. It looked like someone had prepared the place for a guest, not abandoned it after a death. The only sign of recent occupation was a coffee mug in the sink, its interior stained dark. On the kitchen table, a thick slab of oak that dominated the room, sat a manila envelope. My name was written across it in handwriting I didn't recognize. Careful block letters, slightly too uniform, like someone had traced each one multiple times. I picked it up. It was heavier than expected. Inside was a single sheet of paper typed on what must have been an ancient typewriter. The header read simply, "Rules for the property." I actually laughed. It was my first genuine laugh in months, sharp and bitter in the empty house. Of course my eccentric uncle would leave me a list of rules. Probably his idea of a joke, or maybe the rambling instructions of a man who'd spent too long alone. I read them anyway. 1. Never harvest grapes after sunset. 2. If you hear singing in the vines, do not respond. 3. Lock all doors and windows by 7:40 p.m., no exceptions. 4. If someone knocks after dark, pretend you're not home. 5. Never drink wine made from the Southern Rose. 6. Do not enter the vineyard between midnight and 3 a.m. 7. If the vines grow closer to the house, do not acknowledge it. 8. Keep a light on in the kitchen at all times. 9. Do not answer questions from voices you recognize but cannot see. 10. If you find grapes on the porch, burn them immediately. I set the paper down, still smiling, though the expression felt wrong on my face. The rules were oddly specific, not the kind of vague superstitions you'd expect from rural folklore. They had the quality of instructions refined through trial and error, like safety protocols written after accidents had already happened. But they were still ridiculous. I was a grown man inheriting a functional vineyard, not a character in some campfire story. Marcus had probably gotten paranoid in his old age, alone with nothing but his vines and his thoughts. I folded the rules and slipped them into my jacket pocket, more amused than concerned. The rest of the day passed in practical assessment. I walked the property boundaries, examined the vine health, checked the equipment in the barn, a collection of tools so well maintained they looked unused. Everything was in order. Everything made sense. The vineyard was worth considerably more than I'd expected, potentially enough to change my financial situation entirely if I sold it. As the sun began to set, I found myself standing at the edge of the Southern Rose. These vines were different, older. The trunks were thick and gnarled, twisted in patterns that seemed almost deliberate, and the grapes here were darker than the others. So deep purple they appeared black in the fading light. The soil beneath them was a different color too, richer, almost rust red. I reached out to touch one of the grape clusters. The skin was warm. Behind me, the farmhouse looked smaller than it had that morning, dwarfed by the vast expanse of vines that seemed to stretch farther than geometry should allow. The sky above was turning the color of a bruise, and that fermented smell in the air grew stronger, almost narcotic in its sweetness. I checked my phone, 7:23 p.m. I remembered rule number 3 with a mixture of irritation and something else, something that felt uncomfortably like unease. Lock all doors and windows by 7:40 p.m., no exceptions. I looked back toward the house, then at the vines surrounding me. The wind had picked up, moving through the leaves in waves that created patterns, almost rhythmic, almost intentional. I told myself I was being ridiculous as I walked back to the farmhouse. I told myself the rules were a joke, a prank, the paranoid scribbling of a lonely old man. I told myself a lot of things during that walk, and I believed none of them. Back inside, I poured myself a glass of water and pulled out my laptop, intending to research the property's history. But I kept glancing at the windows, at the clock. At 7:35 p.m., I stood and began moving through the house, checking locks I'd already checked. At exactly 7:40 p.m., my phone alarm went off. I jumped so hard I nearly dropped it. The alarm label read, "Lock up." I hadn't set it. My phone showed no history of when it had been created. It simply existed, scheduled for 7:40 p.m. every single day with no end date. I stood in the kitchen, hard hammering, staring at the notification. Then slowly I walked to the front door. It was already locked. I'd locked it at 7:36, but I checked it again anyway, then moved through the house, checking every window, every entrance, every point of access. Everything was secure. I returned to the kitchen and poured myself a glass of wine from an unlabeled bottle I'd found in the pantry. The wine was dark red, almost black, and tasted of cherries and something else I couldn't identify. Something mineral and strange. I stood at the sink, drinking, trying to convince myself that the alarm was just a coincidence, that Marcus had set it on my phone somehow before I arrived, that there was a rational explanation. That's when I heard it, singing, soft and distant, drifting in through the walls like smoke. A woman's voice humming a melody I recognized but couldn't place. Something old, something my mother used to sing when I was very young. when the world still felt safe. The glass nearly slipped from my hand. I set it down carefully, listening. The singing continued, wordless and lilting, coming from somewhere outside, from the vineyard. I moved to the window above the sink, the one that faced the western rose. The sun had set completely now, and the vineyard was a black expanse broken only by the faint moonlight that made the leaves shimmer like water. I couldn't see anyone out there, couldn't see anything moving, but the singing continued. Every rational part of my brain insisted it was wind or a neighbor or an audio phenomenon I didn't understand. But the melody was too clear, too intentional, and it was getting closer. Without thinking, I unlocked the kitchen door and stepped onto the porch. The singing stopped immediately. The silence that followed was total, oppressive, as if the entire valley had inhaled and refused to exhale. I stood there, hands still on the doorknob, scanning the darkness. Nothing moved. Nothing made a sound. Then from somewhere deep in the southern rose I heard footsteps, slow, deliberate, moving through the vines. I went back inside and locked the door. That night I dreamed I was standing in the vineyard while figures I couldn't quite see moved between the rows. Their voices joining in harmony. That same melody over and over, sung by throats that didn't sound entirely human. In the dream, I walked toward them, compelled, and when I reached out to touch the nearest vine, it wrapped around my wrist like a hand. I woke at 3:17 a.m., drenched in sweat. The house was silent. The kitchen light, which I'd left on, was still burning. I got up to get water and saw the wine glass on the counter exactly where I'd left it. It was still half full, but the bottle I'd poured from was empty. I didn't sleep again that night. I sat at the kitchen table, staring at the list of rules, no longer smiling at all. The next 3 days, I convinced myself I'd imagined everything. Sleep deprivation, stress from the layoff, grief over an uncle I'd barely known, these were reasonable explanations. The singing had been wind. The empty bottle was because I'd drunk more than I remembered. The footsteps were animals. The alarm on my phone was something Marcus had somehow configured remotely, a last eccentric gesture. I threw myself into practical work. I cataloged the wine cellar, organized the barn, and reviewed production records that went back decades. Marcus had been meticulous. Every harvest documented, every barrel labeled, every expense tracked. But there were gaps. Whole weeks where nothing was recorded, just blank spaces in otherwise obsessive documentation, and certain sections of the vineyard, specifically the southern rose, appeared in the records less frequently than others, despite clearly being the oldest and most productive vines. I also found something else, a pattern in the dates. Every entry that mentioned the southern rose was marked with a small asterisk. When I cross-referenced those dates, they aligned with new moons, every single one. On the 4th day, I met Caleb. He arrived mid-morning driving a battered pickup truck that announced itself with a grinding transmission. He was younger than me, maybe 25, with the kind of easy confidence that comes from never having questioned his place in the world. Sunburned skin, calloused hands, a smile that revealed slightly crooked teeth. "You must be Marcus's nephew," he said, extending his hand. "I'm Caleb Rivera. I work at the Peterson Vineyard down the valley, used to help your uncle during harvest season." His handshake was firm, his demeanor friendly and uncomplicated. I felt something in my chest unclench slightly. Another human being. Someone normal. "Ethan," I said, "I didn't realize my uncle hired help. Only sometimes." He was particular about who came onto the property. Caleb glanced around, taking in the immaculate rows, the well-maintained equipment. He was particular about everything, honestly. Good guy, but strange. Really strange toward the end. "Strange how?" Caleb shrugged. "Paranoid, I guess." Started talking about the land like it was alive. Wouldn't let anyone work after dark, got obsessive about timing, wrote down all these weird rules. He caught my expression and laughed. Oh man, he left you the rules, didn't he? The famous fucking rules. You know about them? Everyone in the valley knows about them. Marcus showed them to anyone who'd work here. Most people thought he was losing it. That's why he couldn't keep help. People got creeped out. Caleb leaned against his truck, shaking his head with amusement. Look, I liked Marcus. He paid well and treated me decently, but between you and me, I think he spent too much time alone. Started seeing patterns that weren't there, you know? Making up stories to explain normal shit. I should have felt relieved. Here was someone confirming my rational interpretation, that the rules were the product of isolation and deteriorating mental health. But instead, I felt defensive. Did you ever experience anything strange here? I asked. Like what? Singing, footsteps, things that didn't add up. Caleb's smile faded slightly. You hear singing? Maybe. I'm not sure what I heard. He was quiet for a moment, then shook his head. Wind plays tricks out here. Valley acoustics bounce sound around weirdly. Plus, you've got the Peterson place down south, the Rodriguez farm to the east. Voices carry farther than you'd think. His easy smile returned. Don't let Marcus's paranoia get in your head, man. This is a normal vineyard, just grapes and dirt and work. I wanted to believe him. God, I wanted to believe him. We spent the afternoon walking the property. Caleb knew the vines intimately, could identify issues by touch, and assess the harvest timeline with practiced expertise. He was good at his job, and his presence made the vineyard feel ordinary again. Just a business, just agriculture, nothing more complicated than weather and soil pH. As the sun began its descent, Caleb suggested we check the southern rows. Those vines are your money makers, he said. Oldest on the property. Grapes from those rows make wine that sells for serious cash, but they need attention. Haven't been properly harvested in months. I felt that prickle of unease again. Why not? Marcus stopped working them, wouldn't say why, just said they were resting. Caleb made air quotes, rolling his eyes. Like I said, strange. But if you want this place to turn a profit, those southern vines need harvesting soon. Like this week. We walked down together. In daylight, the southern rows looked less ominous. Just older vines, with thicker trunks and darker grapes. The soil was still that rust-red color, rich and dark, and the air here felt warmer, heavier. But nothing supernatural, nothing impossible. Caleb picked a grape and bit into it. Juice ran down his chin, nearly black. Jesus, these are perfect. Sweet but complex. Ethan, seriously, you could make a premium vintage from these. Why the hell wasn't Marcus harvesting? I thought about the rule. Never drink wine made from the southern rows. He had his reasons, I said. Yeah, crazy reasons. Caleb wiped his mouth. Look, I know I'm just the seasonal help, but I've been doing this my whole life. These grapes need to be picked soon or they'll spoil. Harvest happens at night when it's cooler. That's standard practice for premium grapes. We could do it tomorrow night, get it done in a few hours. The rules say not to harvest after sunset. Caleb stared at me. Then he laughed. A sharp, incredulous sound. You're not seriously following those, are you? Ethan, man, they're not real. They're the ramblings of a guy who stopped being able to tell reality from his own head. I didn't answer. Caleb's expression shifted from amusement to something like concern. Listen, he said softer now. I get it. New place, family history, weird circumstances, but you can't let Marcus's issues become your issues. This vineyard is a gold mine if you work it right, but it requires actual work, not superstition. Let me help you. Tomorrow night we harvest the southern rows, proper timing, proper technique. I'll prove to you there's nothing to be afraid of. I looked at the vines surrounding us, their leaves moving in the wind I couldn't feel. The sun was getting lower. I checked my phone, 6:47 p.m. "I'll think about it," I said. "Don't think too long. The window for optimal harvest is closing." Caleb headed back toward his truck, then paused. "Hey, one more thing. If you do decide to follow Marcus's rules, and I really hope you don't, maybe ask yourself why he wrote them down but never explained them. What was he so afraid people would find out?" After he left, I stood in the southern rows as the light faded. The grapes hung heavy all around me, their skins catching the last rays of the sun, and I thought about Caleb's question. What had Marcus been afraid of? That night I made a decision. I would prove the rules were meaningless. I would demonstrate to myself, to Caleb, to the memory of my paranoid uncle, that this was just a vineyard, that the world still followed rational patterns. At 7:45 p.m., I deliberately left the kitchen window unlocked. Nothing happened. The night passed in perfect silence. No singing, no footsteps, no mysterious emptying bottles. I slept through until morning and woke feeling vindicated. Foolish maybe, but vindicated. The rules were nonsense. Caleb was right. I called him mid-morning and agreed to the night harvest. He arrived at 8:30 p.m., his truck loaded with equipment and portable lights. The sun had set an hour earlier, and the vineyard was dark except for the moon waxing gibbous, bright enough to cast shadows. "Perfect night for it," Caleb said, energized, "cool but not cold. Let's make some premium wine." We set up lights in the southern rows, the generators humming as illumination flooded the vines. In the artificial light, the grapes looked even darker, the leaves almost silver. Caleb worked with practiced efficiency, showing me how to cut the clusters and how to handle them to avoid bruising. For the first hour, everything was normal. We filled crate after crate with heavy, perfect grapes. Caleb talked about winemaking, about his family's history in the valley, about his plans to eventually start his own label. His voice was steady, human, real. Then at 10:17 p.m., the generators cut out, both of them simultaneously. The lights died, plunging us into moonlit darkness. Caleb swore and pulled out his phone for light. "Probably just overheated," he said. "I'll check them. Maybe we should call it a night. We're halfway done. Give me 5 minutes." He walked toward where we'd set up the generators, his phone light bobbing between the vines. I stood alone in the southern rows, surrounded by shadows that seemed to move independently of the wind. That's when I heard it. Singing. The same melody as before, but different now. Multiple voices in harmony coming from somewhere deeper in the vineyard. Caleb's light stopped moving. "Do you hear that?" he called out. "Don't respond to it," I said, my voice sharper than intended. "Just come back. It sounds like—" He trailed off. His light started moving again, but away from me, toward the singing. "Caleb, wait!" I ran after him, stumbling through the dark rows, phone light swinging wildly. The singing grew louder, beautiful and terrible, words I almost understood in a language I'd never learned. I caught up to Caleb at the edge of the oldest section, where the vines grew so thick they formed almost a wall. He was standing completely still, phone raised, staring into the darkness between the vines. "There's someone in there," he whispered. "Someone singing. We need to go, now. But they sound like... Ethan, I think it's my sister." "Your sister?" "Maria. She died when we were kids, but that's her voice. I know my sister's voice." He took a step forward. I grabbed his arm. "It's not her. It can't be her. We're leaving." "Let go of me!" He yanked free, anger flashing across his face. "You don't understand. I need to find her. I need to—" The singing stopped. In the silence that followed, we heard movement in the vines. Not footsteps. Something else. Something that sounded like breathing. Multiple sources all around us. "Caleb," I said quietly. Walk back to the truck with me, slowly. Don't run. For a moment, I thought he'd argue. Then he nodded, face pale in the phone light. We backed away from the vine wall, not turning around, watching the darkness for movement. We were 10 feet away when Caleb stopped. "I dropped my clippers," he said. "Expensive ones. I need to go back." "Leave them. Ethan, they're right there. I can—" He turned and ran back before I could stop him. I watched his light bounce as he reached the spot where we'd been standing, watched him bend down, watched him straighten up with the clippers in his hand. Then the singing started again. But this time, it was coming from Caleb. His mouth was closed. His face was confused, frightened. But the melody was pouring out of him somehow, that same eerie harmony, as if his body had become a speaker for something else's voice. He tried to scream, but only singing came out. Then he ran, not toward me, but into the vines, into that wall of twisted trunks and shadow. His phone light disappeared almost immediately, swallowed by the dark. The singing faded with him, growing distant, then silent. I stood there for maybe 30 seconds, maybe 5 minutes. Time felt wrong, elastic. Then I ran back to the farmhouse, locked every door, every window, turned on every light. I didn't call the police. I don't know why. Maybe because I knew how the story would sound, maybe because I knew they wouldn't find him. Maybe because some part of me understood that whatever had Caleb now wasn't something the authorities could help with. I sat at the kitchen table until dawn, staring at the list of rules. When the sun finally rose, I walked back to the southern rows. The generators were exactly where we'd left them, still full of fuel. Our crates of harvested grapes sat in neat rows. But Caleb's truck was gone. So were his clippers. And there were no footprints anywhere. Not his, not mine, not anything. The only thing I found was his phone, wedged between 2 vine trunks in that thick wall of old growth. It was still recording. I took it back to the house and played the video. Most of it was just darkness and confused audio, Caleb's breathing, my voice, shouting his name. Then the singing started. The phone's microphone distorted it slightly, making the melody sound wrong, corrupted. Then Caleb's voice joined in, but overlapped with itself like multiple recordings playing at once, each slightly out of sync. And underneath it all, a sound like soil shifting, like roots moving through earth. The video ended with a single frame that the camera caught before the recording stopped. Faces in the vines, dozens of them, formed from leaves and shadow and something else, something that looked almost like human features but stretched and wrong. All of them are singing. I deleted the video. I deleted it again from the trash. Then I took Caleb's phone outside and smashed it with a rock until it was plastic fragments and silicon dust. The rules weren't funny anymore. There were instructions for survival. I called Caleb's number 17 times over the next 2 days. Each call went straight to voicemail, a generic automated message, impersonal. I drafted texts I never sent. Practiced explanations I couldn't complete. What would I say? That he'd been taken by singing vines? That the vineyard had somehow swallowed him? On the 3rd day, I drove to the Peterson vineyard where Caleb had said he worked. The owner, a weathered man in his 60s named David Peterson, looked at me with polite confusion when I asked about Caleb Rivera. "Don't know anyone by that name," he said. "And I don't hire seasonal help. Family operation." But he told me he worked here. Young guy, mid-20s, drove a beat-up truck. Peterson shook his head slowly. "Son, I've worked this valley for 40 years. Never employed anyone matching that description. You feeling all right?" I left without answering. Drove back to my uncle's property. My property now, legally, though the ownership felt increasingly questionable. I searched county records, social media, and anything that would prove Caleb Rivera had existed. Nothing, no driver's license, no social media presence, no employment history. It was as if he'd never been real. But I had memories, conversations, his handshake, his laugh, the way he'd bitten into that grape and called it perfect. You can't remember things that never happened, can you? I pulled out the rules again, reading them with new attention. Number 9 stood out. Do not answer questions from voices you recognize but cannot see. Caleb had heard his dead sister's voice. And I'd heard, what? My mother's lullaby? Or was I supposed to hear Caleb himself, someone I'd met, someone I'd trusted, someone who'd convinced me to break the rules? The Vineyard didn't just enforce its rules, it tested them. It created scenarios to see if you'd follow or fail. I spent the next week in a state of hyper-vigilant paranoia, following every rule with religious precision. I locked the doors at exactly 7:40 p.m. I never responded to sounds from the Vineyard, and there were sounds every night, different ones, laughter, crying, once what sounded like my own voice calling for help. I kept the kitchen light burning constantly, replacing bulbs the moment they flickered, and I researched. Marcus had kept files, not just production records but newspaper clippings, historical documents, handwritten notes that bordered on obsessive. I found them in the cellar, stored in plastic bins that protected them from moisture and time. The Vineyard's history was incomplete, fragmentary. The land had changed hands frequently. Every 7 to 12 years, a new owner. Some sold it, some abandoned it. 3 previous owners had simply disappeared, their fates recorded as unknown in county records. One had died in what was ruled an accident but described in police notes as unusual circumstances involving the vines. The oldest document I found was a surveyor's map from 1847. The Vineyard location was marked but not as agricultural land. Instead, there was a notation in faded ink. Site of previous settlement, abandoned, do not disturb. Previous to what? Settlement by whom? The map provided no answers, but Marcus's handwritten notes did, though they read less like research and more like warnings compiled through terrible experience. He documented his own learning curve, each rule earned, each price paid for not following them. One entry, dated 6 years ago, described hearing his dead wife's voice in the vines. He'd answered it, called out to her. The next paragraph was a single sentence. The vines were 3 feet closer to the house the next morning. Another entry, dated 3 years ago, mentioned forgetting to lock up before 7:40 p.m. Something had tried the door handles all night. By morning, the wood around the locks was scratched, the marks looking less like tools and more like fingernails, if fingernails could be made of wood. The most recent entries were sparse, shaky handwriting suggesting Marcus's health was declining. But one note, dated just 2 weeks before his death, was written in careful block letters, the same style as the rules themselves. The land doesn't want to hurt us, it wants to keep us. There's a difference, though I'm no longer sure it matters. The vines remember everyone who's touched them. They keep that memory, use it, offer it back. I can hear myself singing now from 7 different years. Soon I'll be part of the chorus. Maybe that's not the worst fate. At least I won't be alone. I set the journal down, hands trembling. Marcus hadn't died of natural causes. He'd been absorbed, integrated. The Vineyard had collected him the way it collected everything else. And I was next. That night, the 8th night since Caleb's disappearance that maybe never happened, I heard knocking. 3 sharp raps on the front door at 8:47 p.m. I was in the living room reading more of Marcus's notes by lamplight. The knock was loud, confident, unmistakably real. I froze. Rule number 4. If someone knocks after dark, pretend you're not home. The knocking came, again. Then a voice. Ethan, it's me, man, let me in. Caleb's voice, exactly as I remembered it, easy, friendly, alive. I don't know what happened, the voice continued. I woke up in the vines, been trying to find my way back. Please, I'm freezing out here. Every instinct screamed at me to open the door. This was a person in need. Someone I'd worked with, laughed with. Someone I'd watched disappear. I stayed silent, stayed still. "Ethan, come on, I know you're in there, I can see the lights." A pause. "Why won't you answer me?" "Because you're not real," I thought. "Because even if you were, you're not Caleb anymore." "Fine." The voice changed slightly, still Caleb's but colder now. "Stay inside your locked house. Follow your fucking rules, but they won't protect you forever. The land is patient. It waited for Marcus. It'll wait for you." Silence. I counted to 100 before I risked moving to the window. The porch was empty, but in the moonlight I could see the vines. They were closer. Not by much, maybe 2 or 3 feet, but enough to be certain. The vineyard rows that had been 40 feet from the house were now 37. Rule number 7 echoed in my mind. If the vines grow closer to the house, do not acknowledge it. I stepped away from the window, returned to the living room, pretended I'd seen nothing. But I couldn't unsee it. And when I checked the next morning, the vines had maintained their new position. Closer, more present, as if the property was slowly contracting around the house. I was running out of time. On the 10th day, I found the grave. I was walking the northern section, the area farthest from the southern rows where the vines were younger and less oppressive, when I noticed a disturbance in the soil. Not recent, but not ancient either. A rectangular depression about 6 feet long, slightly sunken. There was no marker, no indication of what or who it was. But the vines around it grew differently, bending away from the depression as if avoiding it. I got a shovel from the barn. I don't know why. Maybe I needed to confirm something. Maybe I needed to understand what I was really dealing with. Maybe I'd just crossed some threshold where normal caution no longer applied. I dug for 40 minutes before hitting something solid, not a coffin. A stone, flat and wide, is buried about 3 feet down. I cleared the dirt from its surface and found writing, carved deep, uneven letters that looked hand-done. "Here lies the first keeper. He knew the price and paid it, as will those who follow." No name, no date, just a job description and a promise. I covered the stone back up, hands numb despite the warm air. Keeper, not the owner, not a farmer. The word implied responsibility, service, and sacrifice. That night I dreamed about the stone. In the dream I could read more text that hadn't been there. Names carved in a spiral around the edges, dozens of them, each one scratched over when the next was added. At the center, freshly carved, Marcus Hale. And beneath it, waiting to be filled in, Ethan Hale. I woke screaming into my pillow, lights burning around me, the kitchen visible through the open bedroom door. On the table I could see the rules exactly where I'd left them, except there were more of them now. I got up, walked to the kitchen in my boxers and t-shirt, feet cold on the hardwood. The paper was the same typewriter font, same format. But the list had grown. 2 new rules had appeared at the bottom. 11. Do not dig in the north section. 12. When you dream of your name on stone, you have 1 week. My hands started shaking so badly that I had to set the paper down. The vineyard wasn't just reactive, it was communicative. It was watching, learning, adjusting its approach based on my actions. And it had just given me a deadline. I grabbed my laptop and started searching for anything. Vineyard hauntings, agricultural anomalies, cursed land, anything that might explain what it was dealing with and how to escape it. Hours of research yielded nothing useful. Ghost stories didn't cover this. Folklore didn't explain it. Scientific literature pretended it didn't exist. As dawn broke, I accepted the obvious truth. I was completely, utterly alone with this, except I wasn't. Marcus had survived here for decades. He'd learned the rules, followed them, and maintained some kind of equilibrium, and before him others had done the same, a succession of keepers stretching back to that first grave, that first person who'd understood the price. If I was going to survive, I needed to understand what Marcus had known. Not just the rules themselves, but why they worked. What was the vineyard? What did it want? And most importantly, was there any way out that didn't end with my name carved on stone? I went back to the cellar, back to Marcus's files, and started reading with new purpose. Not just documenting facts, but looking for patterns, for the underlying logic that governed this place. 3 hours later, I found it. A journal entry from 15 years ago written in Marcus's younger, steadier hand. I finally understand. The vineyard isn't haunted. It's not possessed. It's a threshold. The grapes don't just grow from soil, they grow from memory, from presence, from the accumulated weight of everyone who's ever worked this land. The southern rows are the oldest because they're deepest. They reach down to something beneath the earth that was here long before grapes, before agriculture, before we had names for what we feared. The rules aren't arbitrary, they're a contract. Follow them, and the threshold remains stable. Break them and you fall through. Become part of what you were trying to harvest. The land doesn't want to consume us, it wants us to tend it, to maintain it, to be part of its continuity. But here's what I've learned. The contract can be negotiated, not broken, never broken, but adjusted. If you give the land what it needs, if you understand what it's preserving, you can find a balance, even a kind of partnership. The previous keeper taught me this before he disappeared, and now I'm writing it down for whoever comes next. Because the land always needs a keeper, and the keeper always needs a choice. I read those paragraphs 5 times, a choice. Marcus had found a choice, a way to coexist rather than just survive. But what choice? And where had he documented it? I tore through the rest of the files, increasingly desperate. The sun was fully up now, the vineyard visible through the cellar's high windows, rows upon rows of perfect vines heavy with grapes I'd never harvest, tended by something I'd never see. Finally, in the very last box, I found a separate envelope, sealed, addressed in Marcus's handwriting to the next keeper. I opened it with shaking hands. Inside was a single photograph and a handwritten letter. The photograph showed Marcus, maybe 20 years younger, standing in the southern rows, with a woman I didn't recognize. They were both smiling, holding wine glasses, the vines behind them lush and vibrant. On the back, in faded pen, Rosa and me. The day I chose to stay. The letter was longer. Ethan, if you're reading this, I'm gone and the land has called you, I'm sorry. I tried to break the cycle, tried to sell the property to someone outside the family, but the land wouldn't allow it. It always calls back those who share the blood of the first keeper. We're bound to it generation to generation, but binding isn't the same as imprisonment. I spent 35 years here and most of them were good. The land is demanding, but it's also generous if you understand it. The southern rows produce wine that people would kill for. The soil yields abundantly. The place sustains you if you sustain it. The choice is simple, fight it, and you'll lose yourself slowly, painfully, until there's nothing left but another voice in the vines, or accept it, become the keeper, learn its rhythms, treat it as a partnership rather than a prison. If you choose to stay, find Rosa. She lives at the valley's edge, in the old Alvarez house. She was the previous keeper's daughter, and she knows more than I ever did. She can teach you what I couldn't write down, how to listen to the land, how to give it what it needs, how to maintain the threshold without losing yourself. If you choose to run, well, you can try. Others have. None made it far. The land's reach is longer than you think, and the calling is stronger than any distance you can travel. I chose to stay. Despite everything, I don't regret it. The land gave me purpose, solitude when I needed it, connection to something older and stranger than I could have imagined. But it's your choice now. Choose wisely. Choose quickly. The land is patient, but not infinitely so. Marcus. I sat on the cellar floor, letter in hand, as the full weight of my situation settled over me like earth over a coffin. This wasn't just a haunted vineyard. It was a legacy, an inheritance more binding than property, more demanding than blood. The land had chosen me before I'd ever arrived, had orchestrated everything, the layoff, the isolation, the perfect timing, to bring me here when it needed a new keeper. And I had 1 week to decide whether to accept that role or join the chorus of voices in the vines. I folded the letter carefully and climbed back upstairs. Through the kitchen window I could see the southern rows, dark and heavy with grapes that would never be harvested, not by me. Not following the old rules. But maybe there were new rules to learn. Maybe there was a way to be a keeper without being consumed. I pulled out my phone and searched for the Alvarez house. Found an address, found a name, Rosa Alvarez, age 73, listed as residing at the valley's eastern edge. It was 9:47 a.m. I had 6 days left. I got in my car and drove to meet the only person who might understand what I was becoming. The Alvarez house sat at the end of a dirt road that wound through scrub oak and dry grass the color of bone. It was smaller than Marcus's farmhouse, a single-story adobe structure with a tile roof and a covered porch that faced west, toward the valley and the vineyard hidden beyond the hills. I parked next to a decades-old pickup truck held together more by rust than steel and sat for a moment, trying to organize my thoughts into something coherent. What was I going to say? That I'd inherited a supernatural vineyard? That I had 6 days before I turned into fertilizer? Before I could decide, the front door opened. A woman emerged, slight, weathered by sun and time, with silver hair pulled back in a braid and eyes that assessed me with unsettling precision. "You're Marcus's nephew," she said. Not a question. "Ethan Hale. Rosa Alvarez." She didn't move from the porch. "You should have come sooner. I only found Marcus's letter yesterday. I don't mean the letter, I mean the first night. When you heard the singing, you should have known you needed help." She studied me like I was a specimen under glass. "But you're like your uncle. Stubborn. Trying to understand everything with logic and research instead of accepting that some things just are." I got out of the car, legs stiff. "How did you know about the singing?" "Because that's always how it starts. The land tests you gently first. See if you'll listen. Sees if you're too proud to ask for guidance." She turned and walked back into the house, leaving the door open. "Come inside. We have much to discuss and not enough time." The interior was cool and dark, thick walls keeping out the heat. The furniture was simple but well made, and the floors were clean tile. Every surface held plants, succulents, herbs, flowers I couldn't name, all thriving in the low light. The air smelled of sage and something else, something green and ancient. Rosa moved to the kitchen and began making tea without asking if I wanted any. I sat at her small table, feeling like a child called to the principal's office. "Marcus wrote that you were the previous keeper's daughter," I said. "My father, yes, Miguel Alvarez. He tended the land for 42 years before it took him." She poured water over tea leaves, her movements precise and practiced. "I was raised on that property. Learned the rules before I learned to read. Understood the land's nature before I understood my own." "But you left." "When my father died, I was the logical successor. Family blood, years of experience. But the land didn't call me." She brought 2 cups to the table and sat across from me. "It calls who it needs, not who expects to serve. It was called Marcus instead, a man from Chicago who'd never farmed a day in his life. Do you know why?" I shook my head. "Because the land doesn't need expertise. It needs belief. It needs someone who can accept impossibility and work within it. My father taught me too well. I understood the land as mechanics as process. Marcus understood it as a mystery. That's what it wanted. The tea was bitter and floral, warming me from the inside despite the heat outside. Marcus's letter said you could teach me things he couldn't write down. Because some knowledge can't be written. It has to be experienced, witnessed, absorbed. She cupped her tea in both hands, steam rising between us. But I can try to give you a framework, context, the land's history as much as anyone knows it. She was quiet for a moment, arranging her thoughts. When she spoke again, her voice had the quality of recitation, a story told many times, refined through repetition. The vineyard stands on a threshold between what is and what was. The indigenous peoples who lived in this valley before European settlement knew it. They had a name for the place, a word that translates roughly as where the old roots grow. They wouldn't build there, wouldn't farm there, wouldn't even hunt there because the boundaries between past and present were too thin. When settlers came, they saw fertile soil and a favorable climate. They didn't see what the land remembered. The first vineyard was planted in 1847 by a man named Joseph Kern. He lasted 6 months before he started hearing voices. 3 months after that, he was found wandering the rows, talking to people who weren't there. He died in an asylum, screaming about singing grapes. Rosa sipped her tea, letting the history settle. Others tried. The land changed hands 16 times in 30 years. Some owners fled, some went mad. 3 simply vanished, their bodies never found. Then in 1879, a man named Samuel Hale arrived. Hale, I repeated, my ancestor. Your great-great-grandfather. He was different from the others. Instead of fighting the land's nature, he studied it, listened to it. And he did something no one else had attempted. He made a pact. What kind of pact? Service for sustenance, cultivation for protection. He would tend the mahud, land according to its needs, following its rhythms, respecting its boundaries. In return, it would allow him to harvest, to profit, to live. But the agreement was binding. Once you accept the role of keeper, you can't simply walk away. The land has invested in you and it expects return on that investment. I set my cup down too hard, tea sloshing. So I'm trapped. You're called, Rosa corrected. There's a difference. Samuel Hale lived to 83, died peacefully in his sleep, and passed the keepership to his son. 4 generations of Hales tended that land successfully. Then Marcus's father, your grandfather, tried to break the pact. Tried to sell the property to a development company. What happened? The sale fell through, then fell through again and again. Every potential buyer either changed their mind or experienced some tragedy that prevented purchase. Your grandfather became convinced the land was cursed. He abandoned it, moved his family back east, swore he'd never return. The vineyard sat empty for 7 years. But it was called Marcus eventually. When your grandfather died, yes. The land waited until the previous keeper was gone, then called the next blood relative willing to answer. Marcus fought it at first, tried to refuse the inheritance, tried to hire managers instead of working the land himself. But the calling is stronger than refusal. He came, and he stayed. I thought about my own journey here. The layoff tad seemed like bad luck. The isolation that had made the inheritance seem appealing. The timing of Marcus's death was right when I was most vulnerable to the vineyard's pull. It orchestrated everything, I said. Didn't it? My circumstances, the timing. It created a situation where I had no choice. The land is patient and strategic. It's been doing this for over a century. Rosa refilled our cups. But here's what you need to understand. The pact isn't slavery. Samuel Hale negotiated terms. Each keeper since has refined them. The rules you found aren't arbitrary punishments. They're the accumulated wisdom of everyone who's successfully maintained the threshold. Maintained it for what purpose? What's the land protecting? Memory. Rosa stood and moved to her window, looking out toward the valley. The southern rows grow over a site that was significant long before grapes. Something happened there. Something that left an impression so deep it literally warped the boundary between past and present. The vines don't just grow from soil. They grow from that accumulated weight of history. They tap into something older than agriculture, older than human settlement. And if that threshold isn't maintained, if the boundary collapses completely, she trailed off. I waited. No one knows, she finally said, because every keeper has succeeded in maintaining it. But my father had theories. He believed that what's beneath the southern rose isn't sleeping, it's trapped. Held in stasis by the vineyard, itself by the continuous act of cultivation and care. Stop tending it and the trap weakens. The past starts bleeding through more strongly. The voices become louder. The vines remember more vividly. What did Caleb? I stopped. There was someone here, or I think there was, named Caleb. But after he disappeared, there's no record he ever existed. Rosa didn't look surprised. The land tests keepers, creates scenarios to see if you'll break rules. Sometimes it manifests temptation directly. Sometimes it provides companions. People who seem real, who encourage you to ignore wisdom, who make rule-breaking feel reasonable. He wasn't real? Any of it. He was real in the moment. The land can pull from memory, from possibility, from the threshold itself. It gave you someone likable, someone you'd trust, someone whose disappearance would teach you to take the rules seriously. She returned to the table. Did you learn? I nodded slowly. I stopped questioning them. Good, that's the first step. Fear is healthy here. It keeps you careful. But you need to move beyond fear to understanding. Each rule exists for a specific reason, and knowing those reasons makes you a better keeper. Over the next 3 hours, Rosa explained, the rules about locking up by 7:40 p.m. weren't arbitrary timing. They corresponded to when the threshold was weakest, when past and present overlapped most dangerously. Lock yourself away and you're protected. Leave yourself vulnerable and things from the other side of memory could reach through. The prohibition against harvesting after dark was about visibility and awareness. At night, you couldn't tell which grapes you were picking. The southern row grapes looked identical to others in the darkness, and those grapes were saturated with threshold energy. Eat them, drink wine made from them, and you risked becoming part of what they remembered. The singing was the land's voice, not malevolent but foreign. Responding to it, acknowledging it, was inviting dialogue with something that didn't think like humans, that existed partially outside time. Once you engaged, it could pull you further into conversation, further into connection, until you forgot which side of the threshold you belonged to. Every rule is a boundary, Rosa explained. Together they create a container that lets you live adjacent to the impossible without being consumed by it. But they're not enough on their own. You also need to give the land what it requires. Which is? Attention, cultivation, respect. The vines need to be tended, not harvested for profit, but maintained as living things. Pruned in winter, watered in summer, spoken to as you work. She saw my expression. Yes, spoken to. The land responds to acknowledgement, to the recognition that it's more than property. My father sang to the vines while he worked. Marcus read them poetry. Find your own method, but make it personal, make it a relationship. And if I do all this, follow the rules, tend the vines, treat it as a partnership, then you'll live. You'll age normally. You'll have solitude and strange beauty and a purpose older than yourself. When you die, naturally in your own time, the land will release you and call the next keeper. And if I refuse? If I try to leave? Rosa's expression darkened. Then you become like Caleb, like the voices in the vines, like everyone who's tried to escape the calling. The land has invested too much in bringing you here to let you simply walk away. You're bound by blood, by inheritance, by the accumulated weight of 4 generations. Running only delays the inevitable and makes the eventual collection more painful. I sat back, feeling the full weight of the trap, no, the calling, settle over me. This was my life now, this strange, impossible responsibility, this inheritance measured not in money but in obligation. Marcus's letter mentioned a choice, I said quietly, between fighting and accepting, between suffering and adaptation. Between seeing this as a curse or a calling. Rosa reached across the table and took my hand, her skin dry and warm, her grip surprisingly strong. I won't lie and say it's easy. It requires sacrifice, isolation. You'll never have a normal life. But normality is overrated, and what you'll gain is something most people never experience. Connection to something vast and old and utterly beyond yourself. Did Marcus regret it? Near the end, he told me it was the most terrifying and most meaningful thing he'd ever done. He said the land taught him to see time differently, to understand memory as something living, to accept mystery without needing to solve it. She released my hand. He died peacefully, Ethan. The land took him gently. That's what awaits you if you choose acceptance. I looked down at my tea, watching the leaves settle at the bottom of the cup in patterns that looked almost like letters. How much time do I have to decide? The dream you've had, your name on stone. That's the land's way of marking time. 1 week from that dream, you need to make your commitment. Either accept the role and perform the binding ritual, or try to flee and face the consequences. What's the binding ritual? Harvest grapes from the southern rows at dawn. Press them by hand. Mix the juice with your blood. Pour it back into the soil while speaking the keeper's oath. It's not complicated, but it's irreversible. Once you bind yourself, you and the land are connected until death. I stood, suddenly needing to move, needing air. Rosa didn't stop me as I walked to her door and looked out across the valley. Somewhere beyond those hills was the vineyard, waiting, watching, calling. I need to think, I said. You have 4 days left. Use them wisely. Rosa joined me at the door. But Ethan, whether you choose acceptance or refusal, do it with full commitment. Hesitation is the most dangerous thing. The land respects conviction, even if that conviction is to resist. What it can't tolerate is indecision. I nodded and walked back to my car. As I drove away, I saw Rosa standing on her porch, silhouetted against the afternoon light, watching me leave with an expression that looked like pity. Back at the vineyard, everything was exactly as I'd left it. The vines stood in perfect rows. The farmhouse waited, patient. The rules lay on the kitchen table, now 12 lines instead of 10. I spent that evening reading Marcus's journals again, but with new understanding. His words were no longer the ramblings of a paranoid man. They were the documentation of someone learning to live with the impossible, recording the process for whoever came next. One entry dated 5 years ago resonated particularly. People think freedom is the absence of obligation, but I've learned it's the opposite. True freedom is finding an obligation worthy of your life and choosing it fully. The land has given me purpose, structure, a reason to wake up. That transcends myself. Is that imprisonment? Or is it the closest thing to meaning I've ever known? That night I dreamed of the southern rose. In the dream I walked between the vines while voices sang all around me. Some I recognized, most I didn't. They weren't threatening. They were inviting, calling me to join their chorus, to add my voice to the accumulated memory of everyone who'd ever tended this place. At the center of the rose stood a figure I couldn't quite see, made of shadow and vine and something else. It spoke without words, directly into my understanding. You are already part of us. You became part of us the moment you accepted the inheritance. The only question is whether you'll be part of us willingly as a keeper or unwillingly as the voices are. Choose. But choose soon. The threshold is weakening and we need a keeper to maintain it. I woke at dawn, sheets soaked with sweat, those wordless words still echoing in my head. 3 days left. I got up, made coffee, and walked out to the southern rows in the early light. The vines were heavy with grapes, almost black in the dawn, their leaves rustling in a wind I couldn't feel. Up close I could see the trunks were carved with patterns. Not random growth, but deliberate marks that looked almost like writing in a language I'd never seen. I reached out and touched one of the trunks. The wood was warm, alive in a way that transcended botany. And for just a moment I heard them. All the voices, all the memories, all the accumulated presence of everyone who'd ever stood where I was standing. Singing, calling, welcoming. I pulled my hand back, heart racing, but the fear was different now. Not terror of the unknown, but awe at the magnitude of what I was being asked to join. I had 3 days to decide if I would. I spent the next 2 days in a state of suspended existence, following the rules mechanically, tending the vines without commitment, treating each hour as if it might be my last on the property. I cataloged my options obsessively, running scenarios that all ended the same way: acceptance or dissolution. On the morning of the second day after visiting Rosa, I woke to find something on the porch. Grapes. A single cluster, dark and perfect, lay carefully on the weathered boards directly in front of the door. The stems were still attached to a small section of vine, as if they'd been carefully cut rather than plucked. Rule number 10. If you find grapes on the porch, burn them immediately. I stared at them for a long moment. They looked innocuous, beautiful even in the early morning light. Dew clung to their skins, making them glisten. They smelled sweet, intoxicating. I went inside, got matches in a metal bowl, and burned them on the porch. They caught quickly, burning with a flame that was faintly purple and produced smoke that smelled like fermentation and something else, something that reminded me of funeral incense. As the smoke rose, I heard it, a sound like a sigh of disappointment coming from the vineyard itself. The land was testing me again, offering temptation, seeing if I'd break a rule out of curiosity, desire, or simple human weakness. I'd passed. But the test told me something important. The land was actively engaged now. It knew my deadline was approaching. It was preparing for my decision, pushing me toward commitment. That afternoon, Rosa arrived unannounced. I saw her truck coming up the drive and met her on the porch where ash from the burned grapes still stained the boards. "You burned them," she said, nodding at the residue. "Good. What would have happened if I'd eaten them?" "You would have seen things, beautiful things, memories of the vineyard's best harvests, visions of prosperity and connection. The land would have shown you everything you could gain from acceptance." She climbed the porch steps slowly, joints stiff. "But they would have been true things. That's what makes the temptation so dangerous. It's not lying. It's offering genuine gifts just prematurely, before you've made your choice freely." We went inside. I made tea, the same bitter blend Rosa had served me, which I'd found in Marcus's pantry. She sat at the kitchen table, looking around the farmhouse with an expression I couldn't quite read. "I haven't been here since Marcus died," she said quietly. "It feels the same. Waiting. Waiting for what? For you to fill the space he left, or to confirm that the space can't be filled, that the land needs to start over with someone else." She accepted the tea I offered. "That's why I came. To tell you something I didn't mention before, something Marcus never wrote down because he was ashamed of it. I sat across from her, anxiety tightening my chest. Marcus tried to leave, Rosa said, 15 years ago. He made it almost to the state border before the land brought him back. How? It spoke to him through every sound, car radio, gas station attendants, wind through his open window. All of it became the Vineyard's voice calling him home. He described it as unbearable, like every cell in his body was being pulled backward by invisible threads. By the time he reached Nevada, he was physically ill, vomiting, feverish, unable to think about anything except returning. She sipped her tea, giving me time to absorb this. When he finally turned around and came back, the symptoms stopped immediately. But the land punished him for attempting escape. For 3 months, the vines wouldn't respond to his care. They grew wild, thorned, and hostile. The southern rose expanded, creeping closer to the house every night. He heard voices constantly, not singing, but screaming. The threshold was destabilizing because the keeper had rejected his role. What did he do? He performed the binding ritual, formally accepted the calling with the oath and the blood. Only then did the land forgive him. Only then did it stabilize. Rosa met my eyes. I tell you this not to frighten you, but to help you understand what rejection means. If you try to flee, the land will pursue you. It won't let you build a life elsewhere. It won't release you to make another choice. It will call you back over and over, making every moment away from this place a torment. So I have no choice at all. You have the most important choice, how you respond to circumstance. You can accept with resentment, treating this as a prison, or you can accept with purpose, finding meaning in the obligation. Marcus chose the latter eventually. It made all the difference. I stood and walked to the window, looking out at the vines. They seemed closer again, though I couldn't prove it. What did the land give him in exchange for his service? Solitude when the world became too loud, purpose when his life felt meaningless, connection to something older than his personal problems, and toward the end, peace. He told me once that he no longer feared death because he understood he'd already become part of something that couldn't die. His individual consciousness would end, but his presence would continue in the land, in the vines, in the ongoing cycle of keeping. That sounds like he was trying to rationalize his captivity. Rosa smiled, sad and knowing. Maybe. Or maybe he found genuine wisdom. The distinction stops mattering after enough years. She stood, joints creaking. I brought you something. Permission to see what Marcus saw. She pulled a small glass vial from her pocket. Inside was a dark liquid, almost black. Wine from the southern rose, Marcus's final vintage, pressed the day before he died. The rules say never to drink it, unless you're ready to see what the land remembers, unless you're ready to understand what you're choosing to join. She set the vial on the table between us. This isn't a test. This is an offer. Drink it and you'll experience the threshold directly. You'll know, without interpretation or explanation, what you're becoming, part of. Then you can make your choice with full knowledge. I stared at the vial. The liquid inside seemed to move independently of the container, swirling slowly. Will it trap me? Force my decision? No. Marcus designed this vintage specifically for you. He knew you'd need to understand before committing. It will show you truth, then release you to choose freely. But Ethan, her expression turned grave, you can't unknow what it will show you. Once you drink it, you'll carry that knowledge forever, regardless of what you choose to do with it. She left the vial on the table and walked to the door. You have 2 days left. Use them to see clearly. And whatever you decide, decide with your whole heart. The land respects conviction above all else. After she left, I sat at the table for hours, watching the vial as afternoon light moved across it, making the liquid inside seem to glow. Every rational instinct told me not to drink it, but rationality had failed me since arriving here. Logic couldn't explain singing vines, impossible visitors, or rules that worked despite making no sense. Maybe it was time to stop trying to understand intellectually and start understanding directly. At sunset, I opened the vial. The wine smelled like earth after rain, like fermentation and memory and time itself. I hesitated, the glass rim touching my lips. Then I drank. The world inverted. I was no longer in the farmhouse, but standing in the southern rows at a moment that was both now and centuries ago. The vines around me were young and old simultaneously. I could see them as saplings and ancient trunks occupying the same space. Time had collapsed into a single point, and I was standing at its center. Voices surrounded me, but I could understand them now. They weren't threatening. They were remembering. I saw the indigenous peoples who'd first marked this place as sacred, who'd recognized the threshold and chosen to honor it from a distance. I felt their reverence, their careful avoidance, their understanding that some places belong to the earth's memory rather than human use. I saw Joseph Kern, the first farmer who'd planted vines, ignorant of what he was disturbing. Watched him slowly unravel as the land pushed back against his intrusion, sending him memories he couldn't contextualize, voices he couldn't ignore. I saw Samuel Hale arrive, saw him discover the threshold and make a different choice, not to conquer or flee, but to serve. I felt his decision like it was my own, the conscious surrender to something larger, the transformation of fear into duty. Then I saw the others. Generation after generation of keepers, each finding their own relationship with the land. Some struggled, some thrived, but all of them eventually found a kind of peace in the role. Not because the land forced them to feel it, but because humans need purpose. And the land provided purpose that was ancient and strange and infinitely larger than individual concerns. I saw Marcus. Saw his arrival, his resistance, his attempted escape, his eventual acceptance. Watched him age across 35 years, watched him develop a genuine love for this place that had trapped him. In his final days, he wasn't afraid. He was grateful. The land had given him meaning when nothing else could. And then I saw what lay beneath the southern rose. Not a monster, not a demon, not anything malevolent. Just memory itself, concentrated and preserved, pressing up against the boundary of the present like pressure against a dam. Every person who'd ever stood here, every emotion they'd felt, every thought they'd had, all of it accumulated in the soil like sediment, layer upon layer, creating something almost alive. The vineyard wasn't trapping these memories, it was holding them gently, giving them form and expression through the vines. The grapes themselves were crystallized memory, and the wine made from them was liquid time. The land wasn't evil, it was a custodian, and it needed keepers to help it maintain that sacred task. I understood, finally understood what I was being asked to join. Not a curse, not a prison, but a lineage of remembering, a duty to keep the past from overwhelming the present, to tend the boundary where human time met something older. The vision released me. I was back in the farmhouse on my knees, the empty vial on the floor beside me. Tears ran down my face, though I didn't remember starting to cry. I'd seen it, all of it, the weight and the beauty and the terrible, awesome responsibility. And I had to choose. I stood on shaking legs and walked outside. The vineyard stretched before me in the twilight, rows upon rows of vines that were no longer just plants but living archives. I could feel them differently now, not threatening but waiting. Patient. I understand, I said aloud, my voice small in the vast silence. I understand what you are. The wind picked up, moving through the vines in patterns that sounded almost like acknowledgement. I went back inside and pulled out Marcus's final letter, reading it again with new comprehension. His words about choice, about meaning, about the land giving him purpose, they weren't rationalizations. They were testimony from someone who'd walked this path and found it worthwhile. But understanding wasn't the same as accepting. I could comprehend the land's nature, appreciate its role, even respect its custodial mission. That didn't mean I was ready to surrender my life to it. I had 2 days left. 2 days to decide if I would become what Marcus became, what Samuel Hale became, what the long line of keepers had become. 2 days to choose between an impossible responsibility and an equally impossible escape. That night I didn't sleep. I sat on the porch watching the stars wheel overhead, feeling the vineyard's presence like a second heartbeat beneath my own. The vines were closer again. I could admit it now. Maybe 30 feet from the house when they'd been 40, on my first day. The land was contracting around me, tightening its hold, preparing for my decision. At dawn, I made a choice. Not the final choice. Not yet, but an interim one. I would spend the next 2 days fully engaged. I would tend the vines as a keeper would. I would speak to them, care for them, treat the land as the living archive it was. Not as a commitment, but as a trial. I would see if I could imagine myself doing this for the rest of my life. If I could, I would accept. If I couldn't, I would at least understand exactly what I was refusing. I started in the northern section, the youngest vines. As I worked, pruning, adjusting irrigation, checking for disease, I did what Rosa had suggested. I spoke to them. "I don't know if I can do this," I said quietly, hands in the soil. "I don't know if I'm strong enough to be what you need." The vines didn't answer, but they didn't need to. The work itself was answer enough, rhythmic, meditative, connecting me to the earth in a way I'd never experienced in my old life of spreadsheets and algorithms. I worked until sunset, stopping only to lock up at 7:40 p.m. When the singing started that night, I didn't fear it. I recognized it now, not as threat, but as the land's voice, the accumulated chorus of everyone who'd come before. I didn't respond, but I listened. And in the listening, I began to hear something I hadn't noticed before. Marcus's voice, faint but present, woven into the harmony. He was part of it now, part of the ongoing song. Still here in a way, still tending. 1 day left. Tomorrow I will have to choose. Tomorrow the deadline would arrive, and I would either perform the binding ritual or attempt to flee. But tonight I sat in the farmhouse that had been Samuel Hale's, that had been Marcus's, that was now mine, temporarily or permanently, depending on what tomorrow brought. And for the first time since arriving, I felt something other than fear or confusion. I felt the strange, terrible pull of belonging. The final day arrived with unusual weather. Fog rolled into the valley at dawn, thick and gray, obscuring the vineyard in a shroud that made distance impossible to judge. I woke early, or perhaps I never slept, and stood at the kitchen window watching the fog press against the glass like something living. The deadline was here. By sunset, I needed to have made my choice. Perform the binding ritual or leave. Stay or run. Accept or refuse. I'd spent the previous day in careful communion with the land, and it had changed something in me. I'd felt the peace Marcus described, the strange comfort of purpose, but I'd also felt the weight of it, the permanence, the isolation, the knowledge that accepting meant surrendering every other possible future. I made coffee and sat at the kitchen table with Marcus's journals, the rules and the instructions for the binding ritual Rosa had written out for me in careful script. At dawn on the day of binding, harvest grapes from the southern rows. Use only your hands. Press the juice into a clay vessel. Add 3 drops of your blood. Pour the mixture onto the soil at the oldest vine. Speak these words. I accept the calling. I will tend what remembers. I will keep the threshold. From this day until my last, I am the land's servant, and the land is my charge. Simple, irreversible. I tried to imagine speaking those words, binding myself for the rest of my life. The rest of my life spent here in this valley, following these rules, tending these vines, maintaining a threshold between past and present. No career, no family, not in the traditional sense. No freedom to simply leave, to choose a different path, to change my mind. But also purpose, connection, membership in something ancient and strange. A role that mattered in ways beyond profit or status or any of the things I'd pursued in my old life. I was still weighing these impossibilities when I heard the knock. 3 sharp raps on the front door. I checked my phone, 8:47 a.m., daylight. The rules about knocking only applied after dark. I opened the door. A man stood on the porch, mid-50s, well-dressed in a way that suggested business rather than farming. He smiled politely, extending his hand. "Ethan Hale, I'm Robert Chen. I tried calling, but my calls weren't going through." His handshake was firm, professional. "I'm a real estate developer out of Sacramento. I heard about your uncle's passing, and I wanted to discuss a potential purchase of the property." I stared at him, processing. A buyer, an escape route. The universe offering me an alternative at the exact moment I needed one most. "I'm not sure I'm ready to sell," I said carefully. Of course, these things take time." Chen pulled out a business card. "But I wanted to make an initial offer. The property is in a prime location, close enough to wine country to be valuable, remote enough for development. I'm prepared to offer significantly above market value. Enough that you'd never have to work again if you didn't want to." He named a figure that made my breath catch. Enough to solve every financial problem I'd ever had. Enough to buy freedom. "I'd need some time to think about it," I managed. "Naturally, but I'm only in the area today. If you're interested, I'd need a decision by this evening, preliminary agreement at least." He glanced past me into the farmhouse. "Would it be all right if I walked the property, just a quick assessment?" Every instinct screamed warning. The timing was too perfect, the offer too generous, and something about Chen's smile didn't quite reach his eyes. "Actually, this isn't a good day," I said. "Maybe you could come back. I understand you've been experiencing some unusual phenomena here." Chen interrupted, his smile unchanging. "Sounds in the vineyard, voices. Your uncle had similar experiences. That's actually why I'm interested. The land has a fascinating history, quite valuable to the right buyer." I stepped back, hand tightening on the door. "Who are you?" "I told you, Robert Chen, real estate." "No." I looked at him more carefully. His clothes were expensive but wrong somehow. The cut slightly off, as if designed by someone who'd seen business attire but didn't quite understand it. His eyes were too steady, unblinking. And now that I focused, I realized I couldn't hear him breathing. "What are you?" The smile widened, becoming something that no longer looked human. "I'm an offer, the land's final test. Will you choose freedom and money, or will you choose obligation and purpose?" Chen, or whatever was wearing Chen's appearance, tilted his head at an angle that bent too far. "It's a genuine offer, you understand. You could take the money and leave. The land would let you. It would release you from the calling, let you build whatever life you wanted elsewhere. But you would carry the knowing. You've drunk from the southern rose. You've seen what the land preserves. That memory doesn't fade. Every day for the rest of your life, you would know you abandoned your post. You would know the threshold is weakening without a keeper. You would know eventually what happens when memory overwhelms the present." The thing that wasn't Chen leaned closer. "Freedom has a price. So does responsibility. The land is letting you choose which price you're willing to pay. And if I refuse both? If I don't take the money but don't perform the ritual? Then you join the voices in the vines, neither free nor purposeful, just dissolved, part of the chorus without the dignity of having chosen it. Not Chen straightened, his form starting to blur at the edges. You have until sunset, Ethan Hale. Choose wisely. He turned and walked off the porch. I watched him disappear into the fog, his outline dissolving until I couldn't tell whether he'd walked away or simply ceased existing. I closed and locked the door, heart hammering. The land was pushing me, creating pressure, making the choice urgent. I spent the next hour pacing, thinking, trying to find some third option that didn't exist. Every path led to the same two endpoints: binding or escape, responsibility or freedom, purpose or possibility. At noon, something else happened. The phone rang. I'd had virtually no cell service since arriving, but now it rang clearly. I didn't recognize the number. Against my better judgment, I answered, "Ethan?" A woman's voice, familiar, impossible. "Mom? Honey, I've been so worried about you." My mother's voice, exactly as I remembered it, though she'd been dead for 3 years. "You haven't called? You haven't visited? Are you eating properly?" I nearly dropped the phone. Rule number 9, do not answer questions from voices you recognize but cannot see. "You're not my mother," I said, voice shaking. "Of course I am. Who else would I be?" The voice carried that particular tone of maternal concern I remembered so well. "Sweetie, I heard about the vineyard, about the inheritance. You need to leave that place. It's not safe. Your father and I, we want you to come home." "Dad's alive?" "Of course he's alive. We're both here waiting for you. Just get in your car and drive back to the city. We'll have dinner ready. Everything will be like it was before all this strangeness." Tears streamed down my face, though I couldn't have said whether they were from grief or rage or the terrible temptation of believing the lie. "You're not real. Neither of you are real. Ethan, please, you're scaring us. Just come home. Tell me something only my mother would know," I demanded. "Tell me what she said to me in the hospital before she died." Silence on the line, then in a voice that no longer sounded quite like my mother. "The land is offering you a gift, a chance to undo grief. Accept the money, leave the vineyard, and in time you'll forget this ever happened. You'll forget the rules, the voices, all of it. You'll remember only that you inherited property and sold it for a profit. Your mind will heal. Your life will normalize. That's not how memory works. The land can make it work that way. It controls memory after all. It could simply edit yours, remove the burden of knowing, let you be free in truth, not just in body." I hung up, turned off the phone, set it on the table and backed away from it as if it were venomous. The land was offering me everything: money, freedom, even the erasure of the trauma of choice. All I had to do was leave, take the gift and go. But I'd seen what was beneath the southern rose. I'd felt the weight of accumulated memory, the importance of the threshold, the necessity of the keeper's role. If I left, that burden would fall to who? The land would have to call someone else, another blood relative, another person dragged into this impossible situation, forced to choose between the same terrible options. Or the threshold would fail entirely. Memory would bleed through without restraint. The past would overwhelm the present, and I had no idea what that would mean for the valley, for the region, for anyone who came near this place. At 3 p.m., the knocking started, not on the door, on every window, every wall. A rhythmic pounding that came from all directions simultaneously, as if the farmhouse itself was surrounded by invisible hands. The fog pressed against the glass, shapes moving in it, human silhouettes that appeared and vanished, faces that formed and dissolved. Then the voices started, My father's voice calling my name. My mother's voice pleading for me to open the door. Colleagues from my old job. Friends I'd lost touch with. Every person I'd ever cared about. All of them outside, all of them begging me to let them in, to come out, to choose them over the land. I covered my ears, but the voices came through anyway. They weren't just external. They were in my head, in my memory, using my own recollections against me. This is a test, I said aloud, trying to anchor myself. This is the land pushing me toward decision. The voices grew louder, more desperate. I heard myself screaming among them, my own voice from the future or the past, impossible to tell which. Begging, crying, singing. I ran to the cellar and slammed the door behind me, descending into the cool darkness where Marcus had kept his journals and files. The voices were muffled here, distant. I could think. On the wall, I noticed something I'd missed before. A photograph framed and hanging in the shadows. I took it down and brought it to the light of my phone. It showed Samuel Hale, my great-great-grandfather, standing in the southern rows. He was old in the photo, maybe 70, his face weathered but peaceful. And he was smiling. Not the forced smile of someone enduring hardship, but genuine contentment. Behind the frame, tucked into the backing, was a piece of paper. I pulled it out, unfolded it. Samuel's handwriting, shaky with age. To my descendants who inherit this, calling, you will doubt, you will fear. The land will test you in ways that feel cruel. But know this, I chose this life freely and I would choose it again. The world beyond these vines offered me nothing that mattered. Here I found meaning. Here I became part of something that transcends individual existence. The choice is always yours. But if you choose to stay, know that you join a lineage of keepers who found purpose in the impossible. And that is a gift more valuable than any freedom. I read it 3 times. Then I folded it carefully and put it in my pocket. Above me, the pounding continued. The voices wailed and pleaded and threatened. The land was throwing everything at me, offering every temptation and every horror, pushing me to my breaking point. But I'd already broken. The moment I drank from the southern rose, the moment I saw what the land preserved, the moment I understood that this wasn't about me at all, I'd already crossed the threshold. I couldn't unknow what I knew. Couldn't unfeel what I'd felt. Couldn't abandon a responsibility I now understood was real and necessary and mine. The choice had already been made. I'd just been too afraid to acknowledge it. I climbed back upstairs. The voices stopped immediately, as if the land had been waiting for my decision and recognized it the moment I did. The fog began to thin. Through the windows I could see the vineyard emerging, rows upon rows of vines heavy with grapes waiting. I looked at the clock, 4:47 p.m. I had time, not much but enough. I went to the kitchen and gathered what I needed. A clay pot Marcus had left in the cupboard, a sharp knife, instructions for the ritual. My hands were steady, my heart was calm. This was terror, yes. But it was also relief. The burden of choice had lifted. Now there was only action. I walked out to the southern rose as the sun began its descent. The vines seemed to lean toward me, expectant. I could feel the weight of centuries pressing against the present. All the keepers who'd stood where I was standing, all of them watching through the threshold, waiting to welcome another name to their lineage. I found the oldest vine, the first one Samuel had planted, its trunk thick and gnarled and covered in those strange carved patterns. I knelt in the rust-red soil, and I began. The grapes came away from the vines easily, almost eagerly, as if they'd been waiting for this moment. I worked quickly but carefully, filling the clay pot with clusters from the oldest vines in the southern rows. The fruit was warm in my hands, the skins nearly black in the late afternoon light, and they seemed to pulse with their own rhythm. Or perhaps that was just my hammering heartbeat echoing back to me. The fog had cleared completely, leaving the sky a deep cloudless blue that would soon turn to gold, then red, then dark. I had perhaps an hour before sunset. Enough time if I didn't hesitate. I carried the filled pot back to the barn where Marcus had kept a traditional grape press, a wooden device that looked ancient, its surfaces stained dark from decades of use. I loaded the grapes and began to press, using my hands as the instructions specified. The juice ran dark as ink, collecting in a basin below. The smell was overwhelming, not just fermentation, but something older. Earth after rain, autumn leaves, the metallic tang of soil rich in iron. And underneath it all, something I couldn't name, something that smelled the way old photographs look. When I'd extracted enough juice to fill the clay pot halfway, I stopped. My hands were stained purple-black and they tingled strangely as if the juice was slightly electric. I carried the pot back to the southern rose, to the oldest vine, and knelt in the soil before it. The knife was sharp. I didn't let myself think too much about what came next. I drew the blade across my left palm. The pain was bright and immediate, but I held my hand steady over the pot, watching 3 drops of blood fall into the dark juice. They swirled and mixed, and for a moment I thought I saw patterns in the liquid, faces maybe, or symbols, or something between the two. Then I began to pour. The mixture sank into the rust-red soil, absorbed instantly as if the earth was desperately thirsty. As I poured, I spoke the words Rosa had given me, and I meant every syllable. I accept the calling. I will tend what remembers. I will keep the threshold. From this day until my last, I am the land's servant, and the land is my charge. The moment the final word left my lips, the world changed. Not visibly. The vineyard still looked the same. The sun still hung in the same position. The vines still stood in their perfect rows. But everything felt different, heavier, more present, as if reality had gained an extra dimension I'd been previously unable to perceive. I could feel the land now, not as metaphor but as actual sensation. It pressed against my awareness like a second consciousness, vast and patient and immensely old. It knew me. It had always known me, had been waiting for me since the moment of my birth, perhaps longer, tracking the bloodline that led from Samuel Hale through the generations to me. And now, we were bound. I stood on shaking legs, the empty pot falling from my hands. The cut on my palm had already stopped bleeding, sealed by something that wasn't quite healing. The edges of the wound had simply closed, as if my body now followed different rules. The sun touched the horizon, spilling red-gold light across the valley. The vines cast long shadows that stretched toward me like reaching hands. Then the singing started. But this time it wasn't frightening. This time I could understand it, not the words, because there weren't words, but the meaning beneath them. Welcome, recognition, relief. The chorus of voices that had terrified me for weeks now felt like greeting, like the land and all its accumulated memory acknowledging their new keeper. I heard Marcus in that chorus, clear and distinct, his voice carrying pride and approval and something like love. I heard Samuel Hale, heard my grandfather who'd tried to flee but had still loved this place in his own complicated way. Heard dozens of others, the whole lineage of keepers stretching back to the very first person who'd recognized the threshold and chosen to maintain it. And I understood. They weren't trapped. They weren't prisoners. They were part of the land's continuity, their consciousnesses preserved the way the land preserved all memory. They still existed in a way, still tended, still kept the threshold even in death. One day I would join them. My voice would be added to the chorus, my memory would be woven into the vineyard, and I would continue the work I'd just sworn to uphold. The thought should have terrified me. Instead, it brought strange comfort. I wouldn't simply end. I would continue transformed but present, part of something that transcended individual mortality. But that was distant, theoretical. What mattered now was the immediate reality. I was the keeper. The land was my responsibility, and I had work to do. I walked back to the farmhouse as darkness fell, following the 7:40 p.m. lockup rule from habit that was already becoming instinct. But when I reached the porch, I found someone waiting. Not Chen stood there again, but his form was unstable now, flickering between human appearance and something else. Something made of vine and shadow and old soil. He smiled his too wide smile. "You chose," he said, not a question. "I chose. The land is pleased, but pleased is not the same as satisfied." He gestured toward the southern rows. "You've bound yourself, yes, but the threshold is still weak. Too many years of Marcus's failing health, too many months without a keeper. The boundary has thinned dangerously. Memory is pressing through too strongly. What do I need to do? Reinforce it, pour your attention into the land, tend it as it hasn't been tended in years. And most importantly," he stepped closer and I could smell earth and decay on him. "Refuse the land when it offers you what you want most." "I don't understand." "You will. Soon. The land tests all new keepers the same way. It offers a gift. Something precious, something you've lost or never had. If you accept, the threshold collapses. If you refuse, it stabilizes." Not Chen's form began to dissolve. Marcus was offered his wife, returned from death. He refused. Samuel was offered wealth beyond measure. He refused. You will be offered something too. And you must refuse no matter how much you want to accept. What will I be offered? But he was gone, dispersed into the twilight like smoke. I locked the doors and windows, hands moving automatically through the routine. Inside, the farmhouse felt different, more like home. The kitchen light burned steadily, and I realized I could feel it, could sense its warmth not just physically but through that new connection to the land. The light was a beacon holding back the threshold's overflow, maintaining a space of present-time stability. I spent the evening reading Marcus's journals again, but now I could read between the lines, understanding the coded references to experiences he couldn't quite articulate. He'd been exactly where I was now, newly bound, terrified, uncertain. But he'd survived, thrived even. I could do the same. At midnight, I woke to a sound I hadn't heard before. A child crying. It came from outside, from the vineyard, clear and heartbreaking, a young boy sobbing as if lost and alone. Every parental instinct I didn't know I had urged me to go find the child, help them, bring them to safety. But I stayed in bed, hands clenched in the sheets, remembering the rules. Remembering that the vineyard tested, that nothing was as it seemed after dark. The crying continued for an hour before fading to silence. I didn't sleep again that night. Over the next 3 days, I threw myself into the work. I tended every vine, checked every irrigation line, pruned with careful attention. I spoke to the land as I worked, not prayers, not pleas, just narration. Telling it what I was doing, asking permission before major decisions, treating it as the conscious entity it was. And the land responded. I could feel it, approval when I did something correctly, gentle correction when I didn't. The vines themselves seemed healthier, their leaves brighter, the grapes plumper. The threshold was stabilizing slowly as my attention reinforced the boundary. But I was also exhausted. The work was physical, yes, but more than that, it was psychically draining. Every moment I was aware of the threshold, of the pressure of memory pushing against the present. Maintaining it required constant vigilance, constant effort. On the 4th night after the binding, Rosa visited. I saw her truck coming up the drive and met her on the porch. She looked at me carefully, assessing. "You did it," she said. "I did it. How do you feel?" I had to think about that. Terrified, exhausted, but also, right, like I'm finally where I'm supposed to be. She nodded, satisfied. That's good. That's what Marcus said too in the beginning. She climbed the porch steps and handed me a basket covered with cloth. I brought you food. You need to eat properly. The land requires a healthy keeper, not a martyr. Inside were homemade tortillas, fresh fruit, containers of soup. Simple food, but it smelled like comfort and care. I hadn't realized how hungry I was. We sat on the porch as the sun set, eating together in companionable silence. Finally, Rosa spoke. The land will test you soon, offer you something. Has it happened yet? No, not yet. What will it offer? I don't know. Something personal. Something that touches the deepest part of who you are. She looked out at the vineyard, her expression distant. My father was offered my mother who died when I was young. The land made her appear exactly as he remembered, offering to bring her back fully if he'd just harvest the southern rose and make wine from them. He refused. It nearly broke him, but he refused. What happens if someone accepts? The threshold collapses. Memory overwhelms present. The land and everything on it exists in all time simultaneously. Past, present, future, all overlapping. Anyone trapped in that collapse doesn't just die. They're distributed across time, existing in every moment at once, conscious but unable to act. It's the worst fate the land can inflict. I set down my food, appetite gone. And it will offer me something like that? Yes. Soon, I think. The land is stronger now that you've bound yourself, which means it can manifest more powerfully. Be ready, and be strong. She stood to leave. Remember, the land doesn't offer false gifts. What it shows you will be real, in a sense. That makes the refusal harder, but also necessary. After she left, I sat on the porch until full dark, wondering what the land would offer me. What had I lost that I wanted back? What did I yearn for deeply enough that the land could use it against me? I didn't have to wonder long. That night at exactly 3 a.m., I woke to voices in the kitchen. Conversation, laughter, the sound of family. I got up slowly, heart racing, and walked to the kitchen doorway, then stopped, frozen. My parents sat at the table, both of them exactly as I remembered. My father in his reading glasses, my mother with her coffee, both of them smiling, alive, real. There you are, sleepyhead, my mother said, looking up. We were wondering when you'd join us. Come sit. We're planning your father's birthday dinner. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. They looked perfect. Sounded perfect. Every detail exactly right, down to the way my father drummed his fingers on the table, the way my mother tucked her hair behind her ear. You're not real, I whispered. Of course we're real, my father said, looking confused. Ethan, are you all right? You look pale. You're dead, both of you. You died years ago. My mother's expression turned sad. Honey, is this about the vineyard? I know the inheritance has been stressful, but there's no need to imagine such awful things. We're right here. We've always been here. She extended her hand across the table. Come sit with us, stay with us. This place is big enough for all of us. We could be a family again, really together like we used to be. Every fiber of my being wanted to take her hand, wanted to believe that somehow, impossibly, they'd come back. That the land had given me this gift, this reversal of grief. But I'd drunk from the southern rose. I'd seen the land's true nature. I knew what this was. No, I said, voice breaking. No, your memory, you're beautiful and you're terrible and you're not them. Ethan, please, my father started. I refuse, I said louder. I refuse the gift, I refuse the offer, I choose the threshold over comfort. I choose duty over desire. The kitchen flickered. My parents' forms wavered, becoming translucent. "Are you sure?" my mother asked, and now her voice had harmonics, multiple tones layered together, the chorus speaking through her. "We could be together. You could have everything you lost. All you have to do is say yes." Tears streamed down my face. "I know, and I'm saying no." They smiled, both of them simultaneously, with identical expressions of pride and sorrow. Then they dissolved, fading into nothing, leaving me alone in the kitchen with only the burning light and my grief. I collapsed to the floor, sobbing. Not because I'd made the wrong choice, but because I'd made the right one. Because duty demanded sacrifices that logic never could. Because being a keeper meant maintaining the threshold even when the land offered everything I wanted. I cried until dawn. Then I got up, washed my face, and went out to tend the vines. The land felt different that morning. Stronger, more stable. The threshold had held. I'd passed the test, and when I walked to the southern rows, I found that the vines had pulled back from the farmhouse, not all the way to their original position, but noticeably. The land was giving space, acknowledging my refusal as the proof it needed of my commitment. I knelt in the rust-red soil and placed my hand on the oldest vine's trunk. The carved patterns felt warm under my palm. "Thank you," I whispered. To the land, to the memory of my parents, to Marcus and Samuel and all the keepers before me. Thank you for the offer, and thank you for accepting my refusal. The wind moved through the vines in response, carrying the faintest echo of singing. I was the keeper. This was my life now, and I would tend what remembered no matter the cost. 6 months have passed since the binding. I'm writing this at the kitchen table. The same table where I first read the rules, where I laughed at my uncle's paranoia, where I saw my parents for the last time in whatever form the land chose to give them. The rules list has grown. I add to it regularly now, documenting new patterns I've discovered, new boundaries I've learned to maintain. The current version has 23 entries. I keep it in a waterproof envelope exactly as Marcus did, ready for whoever comes after me. Because someone will come after me. That's the nature of the calling. One day, decades from now, if I'm fortunate, the land will take me gently the way it took Marcus. My consciousness will join the chorus in the vines, and the land will call another blood relative to continue the work. I hope they adapt more quickly than I did. I hope they don't fight as hard against the inevitable. Life has settled into rhythms I couldn't have imagined during my old existence in San Francisco. I wake at dawn and tend the vines until noon. In the afternoon, I maintain the equipment, update records, perform the small rituals that keep the threshold stable. At 7:40 p.m., I lock every door and window. At night, I listen to the singing. Sometimes fearful, sometimes comforted, always awed by the weight of memory pressing against the present. The vineyard thrives. The grapes are the finest anyone in the valley has ever seen, though I don't harvest them for sale. That's not what the land needs from me. It needs attention, maintenance, acknowledgement. The grapes themselves are secondary. They're memory made manifest, crystallized time, not meant for commerce. But I do make wine sometimes. From the northern rows, the youngest vines following every rule carefully. I drink it on special occasions. Marcus's birthday, Samuel's birthday, my own. The wine tastes like continuity, like lineage, like belonging to something that transcends individual existence. Rosa visits monthly. She's teaching me things Marcus never wrote down. How to read the vine's health by the direction their shadows fall. How to sense when the threshold is weakening before visible signs appear. How to reinforce the boundary through specific patterns of cultivation. She's old now, increasingly frail, but her knowledge is bottomless. I document everything she tells me, adding it to the archive for the next keeper. "You're doing well," she told me last week. Better than Marcus did at this stage. You've accepted what you are instead of fighting it. I still fight it sometimes, I admitted. There are days I want to leave, days I resent being trapped here. That's natural. Even Samuel had those days, but you stay anyway. That's what matters. Not the absence of doubt, but the presence of commitment despite doubt. She's right, of course, but the commitment costs more than I expected. I haven't spoken to another human being besides Rosa in 3 months. The isolation is profound, deeper than loneliness, more absolute than mere solitude. I exist in a pocket of strangeness that no one else can enter, maintaining a boundary that no one else can perceive. Sometimes I talk to the land, tell it about my day, my thoughts, my fears. It doesn't respond in words, but I can feel its attention, vast and patient, like speaking to the ocean. Other times I talk to the chorus, to Marcus specifically. I don't know if he can actually hear me or if I'm just talking to memory, but it helps. The vineyard has changed me physically, subtly but noticeably. My hands are always faintly stained purple no matter how much I wash them. My eyes have developed flecks of deep red like wine viewed through light. I heal faster than I should. Cuts close within hours, bruises fade in days. Rosa says it's the land's way of maintaining its investment, keeping its keeper healthy and functional. But the deeper changes are psychological. Spiritual maybe, though I've never been religious. I experience time differently now. The present moment feels thinner, more permeable. Sometimes I'll be working in the vines and I'll see them as they were decades ago, younger, differently pruned, tended by keepers whose names I've only read in journals. Other times I'll see them as they will be years after my death, maintained by whoever comes next. The threshold works both ways, I've learned. It's not just holding back the past from overwhelming the present. It's also protecting the present from being erased by the future. Time here is a negotiation, not a constant, and I'm the mediator. This understanding came with a price. I don't sleep well anymore. Can't really. Even when I'm unconscious, part of me remains aware of the threshold, monitoring its stability. I dream about the vines constantly. Not nightmares exactly, but intense, exhausting visions of cultivation and care that feel like work even in sleep. Rosa says this will ease with time, that experienced keepers learn to let the land shoulder more of the burden, to trust the threshold to maintain itself for a few hours while they rest. But I'm not there yet. Maybe I never will be. The singing has changed too. I can understand it now, not as language, but as emotion and intent. The chorus isn't just remembering, it's active, tending the land from the other side of the threshold. Marcus is particularly present. I feel him in the southern rows, guiding my hands during difficult pruning, correcting my mistakes before I make them. Sometimes I wonder if death will be a relief, a transition from the exhausting work of physical maintenance to the gentler labor of memory. Other times, the thought of losing my individual consciousness, of being distributed into the chorus, terrifies me more than anything. But that's distant, theoretical. What matters is now. Today I added a new rule to the list. If you see yourself working in the vines, do not approach. You are witnessing temporal overlap. Continue your current task and the vision will fade. This happened 3 days ago. I was pruning the eastern section when I looked up and saw myself, another me, slightly older, working 2 rows over. We made eye contact. The other me nodded, then faded like fog in sunlight. Rosa explained that the threshold is strengthening, that my presence is reinforcing it so effectively that time itself is becoming more fluid on the property. This is good, she said. It means you're succeeding, but it also means you need to be more careful. The rules exist to protect you from paradoxes your mind can't process. So I added the rule, dated it, and filed it with the others. The envelope is getting thick. Last week, someone came to the property, a woman in her 30s driving a rental car looking lost. She knocked on the door at 3 p.m. Well, within safe hours. "I'm looking for the Hale Vineyard," she said when I answered. "I'm writing an article about historic wine country estates. Mind if I ask you a few questions?" I should have said yes. Should have maintained normal human contact, practiced conversation, pretended to be ordinary. But I looked at her and saw only risk, someone who might notice the strangeness, might ask questions I couldn't answer, might complicate the careful isolation I've built. "This is private property," I said. "I'm not open to visitors." "Just a few questions? I've come a long way." "No. Please leave." I closed the door, watched through the window as she returned to her car, confused and slightly offended, watched her drive away. Then I went back to the vines and tried to ignore the part of me that wanted to run after her, to beg her to stay and talk, to connect me to the normal world I'd left behind. This is what I'm becoming. Someone who refuses human contact. Someone who prioritizes the land over people, duty over connection, the threshold over everything else. Rosa says this is temporary, that I'm overcompensating, being too cautious, isolating more than necessary. Marcus had friends, she reminded me. People who knew about the land and accepted it. You don't have to be completely alone, but Marcus had decades to build those relationships. I've had months, and I'm not ready to explain to anyone what I am, what I do, what I've become. Maybe next year. Maybe when the threshold is stronger, when I'm more confident in my role. Maybe when I've found language for the impossible. For now, I tend the vines. I follow the rules. I listen to the singing and try to find comfort in the chorus. And I write documentation for the next keeper, instructions, warnings, encouragements. Everything I wish Marcus had told me directly instead of leaving me to discover through terror and trial. Sometimes I imagine that future keeper reading my words. Wonder who they'll be. A cousin I've never met, a sibling I don't have, someone so distant in the family tree that they don't even know the Hale name carries this burden. I want to tell them, it's not as terrible as it seems at first. The fear fades. The strangeness becomes normal. You'll find rhythms, meaning, even beauty in the impossible. But I also need to warn them, you will lose yourself. Not all at once, but gradually. The person you were before the calling will fade, replaced by the keeper. And you'll mourn that loss even as you accept it. Is it worth it? I don't know yet. Ask me in a decade. Today is October 17th. The vines are heavy with unharvested grapes, purple-black in the autumn sun. The air smells like fermentation and memory. In the kitchen, the light burns constantly, a beacon of present-time stability. Tonight, I'll lock up at 7:40 p.m. I'll listen to the singing. I'll dream of cultivation and care. Tomorrow, I'll wake at dawn and begin again. This is my life now. This strange, terrifying, beautiful responsibility. This inheritance measured in memory and time and impossible duty. I am the keeper. I tend what remembers. I maintain the threshold between past and present, between memory and now, between the accumulated weight of everyone who came before and the uncertain future of everyone who comes after. And sometimes, increasingly often, I hear my own voice in the chorus, faint but present, singing from the other side of the threshold. From the future where I've already joined the vines. That future self sounds peaceful, fulfilled, complete. I hold on to that sound on the difficult days. It reminds me that this calling, though terrifying, leads somewhere worth going. That the keepers who came before found meaning in the work. That I will too, eventually. Until then, I follow the rules. I tend the vines. I wait. The land is patient, and so am I. We have all the time in the world, past, present, and future, all held in careful balance. All we need is someone to maintain that balance. someone to keep the threshold, someone to remember. If you're reading this, I'm gone. The land has taken me and you are the next keeper. I've left everything you need, rules, journals, instructions, warnings. Rosa will help you if she's still alive. If not, you'll have to learn as I did. The binding ritual is described in the blue notebook. Perform it exactly as written. Don't delay. Don't try to refuse. The calling cannot be ignored. This will be the hardest and most meaningful thing you ever do. Trust the process. Trust the land. Trust the keepers who came before. We're all here in the vines singing, waiting for you to join us, not in death, but in duty. Welcome home. Ethan Hale, keeper of the threshold, steward of memory.